doing this, and we are doing this as promised. We decided we're going to start. We're going to finish this half season with a very hot topic with ACL injuries. There is a rumor out there that there is a pandemic going on. I'm not sure if we're going to answer this question right now, but I'm sure we're going to hear many new and good things from our experts today. But I'm not spoiling the surprise, and I'm passing the floor to Evert Verhagen, who will introduce you. Evert.
You clicked me away already. So welcome to this last medical webinar before we go on a little summer break, and we're going to enjoy Euro 24. We go out with a bang before we take this little break, like Zoran already said. This one is about ACL injuries, ACL injury prevention. And we chose this topic also for a little bit of a reason. There is a lot of chatter about that. There's a lot of media and hype and also research about it. But at UEFA, we're also working on a campaign around ACL injuries and their prevention. This will not happen too soon. This will happen around Euro 25 when we have the Women's Euro in Switzerland. But there's a lot of build-up to that. And today we would like you to present to you two of the members of a panel that's working with us to develop that campaign. So we have Anne Benjaminsen from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and we have Carly McKay from the University of Bath in the United Kingdom, who will share with us their insights on ACL injury prevention. Before we also start, we would like again to acknowledge that we do this together with the European, the ECA, the Club Association. Sorry for that. So if you could please put your club and your country into the comments box, in the chat box in YouTube, that helps us also to communicate better with the ECA and better attune these meetings to your needs and demands. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Anne and Carly quickly to the stage. Hi, Anne and Carly. Thank you for joining us today. Interesting topic. I know you know a lot about them. So I hope the audience is in for a treat. What we're going to do for everybody, and you requested that, we're going to have back-to-back presentations. It's all in one slide show. And then after that, we're going to have a bit of a longer Q&A where we would like everybody to put their comments and questions into the comment box on YouTube. And then we will moderate that to both of you. Okay? So I'm going to say goodbye to Carly for a few minutes and then leave us with Anne here. I'm going to add to the stage the presentation that was prepared. So Anne, the screen is yours. And I'm going to try to keep up with your presentation on the background. Okay?
Thanks, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Evert, and thank you, UEFA Medical Team, for the invite. And I indeed hope to share some interesting thoughts with you today. So my talk will be about the what and how of ACL injury prevention. And I actually want to start with showing a video of Vivianne Minima, one of the star players from Arsenal. Leaving Arsenal, actually, I learned about and learn about her ACL injury mechanism. What we can see here is that it is important to not only look at what biomechanically happens. We all know the mechanism, landing with a straight knee, the foot placed out of the center of mass. But what we can also see that it's way more complex than that. There's an attacker approaching her. Thank you, Evert, for showing again. And Vivianne needs to anticipate actually on what the attacker will be doing. She thinks the attacker is going to pass the ball to the right, but actually it's going to be on her left side, and she decides to change her direction, and that's when the ACL injury happens. So it's complex. Let's conclude that. So if we look at the current ACL injury prevention methods, we of course have the Viva 11 Plus. And I think it's great that this initiative has been launched a while ago with good exercises. But I think if we leave it to only these exercises, It's good for like basic strength and conditioning, but it's not really covering the real world context the players are facing. The exercises, and you can start the video, Evert, are pretty much pre-planned, closed. And the example that I'm showing you now is the example of an exercise, how to improve change of direction technique. But as you can see, this is kind of out of context. Of course, this as a basics, this may be important to do so, but I do not think, or I do think, let's state it this way, that we can help our athletes better, and basically not only training the perfect technique, but moving towards more a skill approach. What is the skill that they basically need? And that's broader than only practicing the perfect technique. Okay, next slide, please. Because what we're seeing also currently with the current FIFA 11 program, it is poorly implemented, unfortunately. When we look at exercise 9, the plant and cut exercise, it's only only 10% of the in this research of the people implemented it, and it's often also modified. A couple of barriers are that the exercises are experienced as being boring, not being sport specific, and not being challenging enough. So we need to look, I think, critically at what we are teaching them, and are we basically teaching them? Is it good to teach them a perfect technique, or do we need to allow variation within the training programs? Because this is basically what happens in real life, repetition without repetition. And I think we need to allow variation within our injury prevention programs, basically, because then we are preparing them better for the real world. So is it good actually to practice a perfect movement form, or can we allow within the safe range, of course, some variation? And I think we can, because inherently there is always within a person within person variation. So each time we perform a motor skill, it's not performed exactly the same way. And even when we look at between persons, there's also great variations actually, because every body, every brain is different, so we move differently. So this also has consequences for the way we implement ACL injury prevention, and we need to allow some variation within and between persons. So we will accept this has consequences for the way we coach. So are we actually practicing the ideal movement technique, or do we allow some adaptable movement solutions? And I think we can. And we can allow some adaptable movement solutions, and basically also practice variation within the exercises. So as you can see here, don't only practice, like I said, the pre-planned, closed, out of context skill of cutting, but for example, add a player, make the space a little smaller, let them react to colors, to already not only pay attention to what they do, but also pay attention to their environment. They need to pay attention to the other player in this case. So where is she in space? So that and where am I? And what do I need to do to perform my change of direction movement correctly? Another example on the next one is, for example, here with a simple rondo exercise where this player it needs to intercept the ball, of course, as an attacker, but she doesn't know where to go beforehand to integrate some unanticipated actions. So here again, just like within the ACL injury mechanism with Viviane Miedemes, needs to anticipate. And the last example, to allow some variation and don't only focus on the physical context, but also on the more neurocognitive context of ACL injury prevention, is shown here. There's an attacker and there's a defender, and the girl needs to chase another girl to be able to tag her. So she's cutting around the cone, make it more challenging, make it more sport specific. There's a ball involved, there's attackers and defenders involved, and it's more fun. Also very important in my opinion. Tackling also the barrier of being boring. So we also need to look, that's the second part of my presentation, on how we are teaching athletes the motor skills. Currently, this is predominantly done with, so to say, explicit instructions. For example, to improve the alignment of the leg in the frontal plane, do not let your knee buckle inwards. For the sagittal plane, bend your hips, bend your knees to adopt the correct movement form. However, I think there's more, or there's better alternatives to this. And on the other side, we have the implicit motor learning, way of motor learning. And one example of doing so is to use analogy learning. For example, here in a defending action, the girl in red is defending. Just like with Viviane Miniman, needs to anticipate on a fake movement, and to be able to, or to teach her to sit deep, so to say, while defending, to improve knee flexion, of course, and decrease joint loads. You can also tell her, instead of flex your knees or bend your knees, pretend you're going to land or to sit on a chair. This is, of course, a different way of teaching, but plenty of research has shown that this way of teaching leads to better retention and transfer over time. And these are two very important aspects in motor learning and also in ACL injury prevention. Yep, so on the left, explicit instructions, on the right, implicit instructions. And feedback. So, and why is it that implicit motor learning leads to better retention and transfer? Well, I always like this saying of Benjamin Franklin: tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I will learn. The thing is, with implicit motor learning, we are involving our athletes better. And that is because learning is a problem-solving process. And the more involvement athletes have in analyzing and reflecting on their own actions, the better the learning value. So that means, you can go to the next slide, Evert. Thank you. That we shouldn't too often give them the solution already of what we want to see, but we should stimulate self-regulation and discovery on how to solve that problem. So I always like this tweet of Neeraj Rotem. Too often we jump in after the learner has done a few reps incorrectly or unsuccessfully, but we should let them practice and explore before interrupting and correcting. Think of the last time you learned a new task. It takes time and practice. And of course, it's appealing as a coach, as a physio, to correct an athlete when you do not see what you want to see. However, over the longer time, it's better to stay quiet a little, if possible, and let them figure out, okay, my current trial was successful, not successful, how did it feel, what did I do, and how can I do better the next time? Of course, you need to be there as a coach, as a physio. Don't let it go wrong for too long and too much. But it's good to not overcoach, because learning takes time. So the role as a coach may be reconsidered in this topic of motor learning, to have to facilitate our athletes more instead of instructing them exactly what to do. So implicit motor learning is more facilitating. For example, I give the instruction, when defending, pretend to sit on a chair, instead of, and then with that implicit motor learning instruction, then the athlete has to think, okay, how am I going to sit on a chair? Well, of course, she is bending her knees, and there you go already. While with instructing more with explicit instructions, then you already give the solution, bend your knees, and we are telling the instruction then to the athlete, and the athlete is less involved in their own learning process, their own motor learning process. Next one. So you can also reconsider your role as a physio coach. So give the athlete time to process the intrinsic feedback. What does the player feel? Was it effective? How can I do better next time? Then your role as a coach or as a physio is to provide, also to help, of course, and provide feedback in the learning process. Like I said, it's good to not too often provide feedback, to have them discover themselves also. But then if you want to give feedback, there's two options. You can give them explicit feedback, like I said, the more traditional approach, or you can give them implicit feedback. Well, and the latter, like I said, leads to better retention and transfer, which is crucial for motor learning and thus for ACL injury prevention, because one of the items of injury prevention is to improve the quality of movement. So we've done some research on this, and one way to provide implicit feedback is to, for example, use video feedback. And you can use video feedback of athletes, of an expert athlete or a model athlete, or have athletes watching themselves. And of course, you do not control what the athlete is looking at. He or she can still look at the knees or other parts of the body, but with your verbal instructions along with the video, you can instruct the athletes, try to mimic the entire movement of the model or of yourself, try to copy the movement, and don't pinpoint at specific parts of the body. So then there's other ways to implement implicit learning. And that's, for example, analogy learning or external focus instruction. So for example, here to improve knee abduction, and this should be a video, Evert. Yep, thank you. Also with cutting, you see again, it's a playful environment. You can instruct the athlete if she or he has a logo on the middle of her shirt to point the logo of the shirt towards the new running direction while cutting. Pretend your knee is the headlight, direct it to the new running direction. And this may all sound a little bit strange, but research really has shown that if you try to implement these kind of wordings, that athletes start to playfully play around with how to solve that problem. The logo of the shirt, move it to the new direction, move the headlight to the new direction to improve frontal plane alignment. And to improve sagittal plane alignment, you can also play this. There's other instructions. Push yourself off of the ground as hard as possible has been shown in research to a lot to improve knee flexion. I want to see your cleats in the grass. Makes athletes also bend their knees to push off more forcefully. We're making the cut accelerate like a rocket. Is also one frequently used. With all these analogy learning examples or external focus examples, you need to consider the age of your athlete, of course, which cue does work, which cue doesn't work, but it's definitely worthwhile to play around with this. Next one, please. So my take home is that it's time, I guess, to consider the what and how of ACL injury prevention to make sure the improved motor skills remain stable in the sport-specific context. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I think that's a clear take-home message. And the next slide is already waiting for Carly. So I think for a few minutes, we're going to say goodbye to you, Anna, and then get back to you. If anyone has any questions for Anna, please put them in the comments box. Same goes, of course, for the next presentation by Carly. Thank you, Anna, so far. I'm going to thank you more later, and I have some questions for you waiting. So please don't log off yet. Hi, Carly.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Carly is a world-renowned expert on implementation in terms of injuries and injury prevention, and also ACLs a little bit. So, Carly, please take it away for us here.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the implementation of injury prevention programs, specifically for ACL injuries. So there we go. So if we took a look at the research evidence, recently there have been a lot of systematic reviews that have shown us that neuromuscular training programs, so as we've just heard, the 11 plus, or it could be knee control or a similar program like that, if teams use them during the course of a season, the evidence suggests that we might see roughly a 45 to 50% reduction in the risk of ACL injuries. That sounds really promising, and yet we're still seeing headlines that suggest maybe those benefits that we're seeing in the research don't translate into practice. So Avert, if you can click ahead. We're seeing headlines that suggest there's a tsunami of ACL injuries, particularly in women's football, or there's this crisis or epidemic of ACL injuries. And it becomes hard to reconcile. How does the research suggest that we have the tools to reduce these by upwards of 50%, but we're not seeing that translate into any real world reductions in the number of these injuries in practice? And one of the reasons for that, if we borrow from the field of implementation science, is that there's a bit of a downward slope when we take injury prevention programs out of the research, so these tightly controlled conditions where we see 40, 50% risk reductions, and kind of let them loose in the real world. And what we see are these things called scale-up penalties. And the first is what we call voltage drop. And that's the idea that only some people will actually end up using that program in reality. And that's because only some people know about the program, or some people take a look at the program and decide, actually, no, that's not for us. The other thing we see is what we call program shift. And this is the idea that even amongst those people who do decide to use an injury prevention program, in a lot, if not every case, they end up adapting that program. So they'll swap out some of the exercises that they don't like in favor of ones that they prefer, or they might reduce the amount of time they spend doing the exercises. They might turn them into games, or in some other way change them to make them easier to incorporate into their normal training routines. Ultimately, the effect there is that outside of those controlled conditions, we start to see the programs have a little bit less effect. And ultimately, we have to start thinking a little bit about the psychology behind that. Why do we ever change our behavior? Why do we do the things that we do? And when we're talking about preventing ACL injuries, the research shows us that there are 3 basic conditions that have to be in place for anyone to even consider engaging in prevention behavior. So the first of these is risk perception. And so this is the idea that, number one, we have to have an awareness that there is an ACL injury risk, and we have to understand what our own personal risk of ACL injury might be. If we don't think we're at risk, we're very unlikely to take preventative steps. The second condition that has to be met is we have to believe that the injury prevention program or strategy has a likely impact on our risk of injury. So we have to believe that it's going to have an effect on the outcome. And the third condition that has to be in place is self-efficacy. So we might think we're at risk of an ACL injury. We might believe that this training program or this warm-up has a good chance of preventing those injuries. But if we're not confident, we don't have the self-efficacy that we can do the exercises correctly or incorporate them into our normal training routines, again, we're not going to consider taking on board that injury prevention program. So we won't form an intention to do so. Now, the evidence also suggests that intentions don't always lead to behavior. So anybody who's ever made a New Year's resolution probably knows this all too well. We start out the new year suggesting to ourselves that, no, this is the year I'm going to spend more time away from my desk out in nature. I'm going to get on top of that project that I've been working on. Or even on a day-to-day basis, we start to think a little bit about, I'm going to stay on top of the housework, or I'm going to do all of those little jobs that I've been promising myself that I was going to do. Inevitably, what happens is life gets in the way. Other priorities start to take precedence, or barriers come up, challenges that we didn't expect. And ultimately, we might have the best intentions in the world, but we don't end up following through on them. What does that mean then in terms of prevention behavior? Well, even if we do form those intentions to, say, adopt the 11 plus, the realities of actually using it can pose new barriers as well. And this is a quote from a coach that I've worked with. Now, within the 11 plus, as players become more proficient with the exercises, there are additional levels that you can move up to, make the exercises more challenging and interesting for the players. But that in itself posed a problem, because for this coach, the program kept changing. They had to remember all of the new exercises. They had to remember all of the new coaching cues and types of feedback to give to the athletes. And it meant that they had to keep changing themselves, which is ultimately why they took the program and adapted it to make their own version of it, that they could keep consistent throughout the year and didn't have to keep changing. So it's not just about forming an intention to use these programs, it's actually about following through and getting over the barriers that arise along the way. Next slide, please. The important thing to remember is that there are always going to be barriers to doing ACL injury prevention. So when you talk to footballers, their coaches, the administration at the club, even for young footballers, their parents, the reason they're there is for performance. It's about winning. It's about pushing their skills to the next level. And if performance is the priority, oftentimes injury prevention kind of gets relegated to those few spare moments they have during the week. And attached to this are some other barriers around resource. The primary one that we see is time. For example, if you're in a team that trains an hour at a time, it's a big ask to give up 20 minutes of that training time to do an injury prevention warm-up program. So teams are unlikely to do that. Or they might be operating in an environment that doesn't have a lot of resource, be that facilities or equipment or coaching expertise, in order to implement those programs successfully. Some other common barriers that we might see. Within clubs, there are often a lot of different people who have an opinion about what injury prevention should be done. And when you get a lot of those different opinions in conflict with each other, sometimes it results in nothing being done instead of upsetting one person or another. Or player behavior can be really difficult to predict. So sometimes players buy into injury prevention and they're really keen to do the programs. But if you turn up as a coach or a medic and you're trying to lead a warm-up and the players have absolutely no interest in doing it, you're going to have a really difficult time, not only to get the exercises done, but to get the quality of movement that's required in order to see a benefit. And of course, one of the biggest barriers we see is that the evidence says that we should be seeing a 40-50% reduction in the number of ACL injuries if we do this program. Well, if you start using it at the start of a season and you actually end up with 1 or 2 ACL injuries in your team, you're going to say, well, this program is no good. It doesn't work. We're going to stop doing it. So there are always going to be these barriers in place. And we also have to remember that what we think of is ideal conditions. So on the left side of your screen, you see an image from the original 11 plus. This is what they imagined it would be like to do some of these exercises, but the environment isn't always conducive to that. And on the right, that's the reality of recreational girls soccer in Canada, where you actually have to shovel the snow off the pitch in order to do the exercises. And so we can design the best programs in the world, but the reality is that teams are competing within an environment that doesn't always support the use of those programs. So what do we do about this? So if we know that these conditions have to be in place for people to form an intention, but we know that intentions don't always lead to behavior, we need to put something in place in between. And those things are what we call action plans. Now, we know that people form action plans when they decide who is going to lead the injury prevention, who's going to be responsible for it, when are we going to do it, where are we going to do it, and if we miss doing it at 1 or 2 sessions, how do we get back on the wagon and start doing it again? And we know from research that I've done and others that people who form strong intentions to use the program in the preseason are 4 times more likely to stick with it throughout the season. But ultimately, those who have action plans, so concrete ideas about who, what, when, and where, are 3 times more likely. And so the key here is to not only figure out a way to build intentions, but also figure out a way to build action plans to turn those intentions into behavior. So next slide, please. One way that we can do this, and there's quite a bit of research around it now, is through workshops. These are typically delivered to players, oftentimes at coaches, but any sort of team meeting or other venue might work for this as well. And the way we've done it in practice is, number 1, sit down and try to develop accurate risk awareness and set realistic expectations about what an injury prevention program might be able to bring to the team. Now, this might be in terms of medical needs, so actual injury risk reduction, but you also might consider the performance benefits that come from doing the program, or actually at the upper end, the elite end of the spectrum, how much salary are you going to save when you have all of your players available for selection because they aren't injured? The second piece, and really the key to driving behavior, is building self-efficacy. And the evidence shows us that that is the primary reason that people don't engage in injury prevention. And so this might be going out on the pitch to actually spend time coaching the exercises, practicing them, get to know what it feels like to do the exercises correctly and incorrectly, get practice in delivering feedback to athletes, just as we heard Anna speak about, or it might be actually going out into the community and building a network of coaches who are all using the same or similar approaches and learn lessons from each other. And finally, it's about sitting down and making those concrete action plans. Now, in a workshop, you might sit around as a round table with everybody at the club who's involved to think about that plan, but it also might take the form of individual brainstorming about what are the likely barriers I'm going to encounter and what are my strategies for getting over those. Or it might, again, be about relying on a network of coaches within the club or coaches in the wider community to share strategies, give each other feedback on how the implementation is going, and try to troubleshoot when things don't go quite according to plan. So we also have to remember that whilst our tendency is to try to implement injury prevention strategies with the athletes and their coaches, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are primarily going to be responsible on a day-to-day basis for injury prevention. They don't exist in a vacuum. And so we have the athlete, but outside of that, they also exist within the context of their club, their local governing body, potentially a national or international governing body, and the culture of football in their part of the world. And all of those exert an influence on injury prevention behavior. Now, some of them are really supportive. So, for example, you might be lucky enough to be at working within a governing body that they have policies in place to help implement injury prevention strategies. Or some influences can actually be barriers. So you might be at a club, for example, where there isn't a lot of resource available to put into injury prevention. And so whatever strategy you intend to use is ultimately going to be influenced by the wider context that you're working with. So on the next slide, the real important point here is that it's not just about individual behavior. It's not about an athlete deciding, I'm going to go out and I'm going to do the 11 plus, or a coach saying that I'm going to implement this with my team for the season because I think it's really important. Those systems and structures have to be in place to support that behavior change. It's a bit like expecting coaches and athletes to get on with their task while there's a tornado raging around them. And so we ultimately have to think about who are all the stakeholders who have an influence on injury prevention, and can we actually get everybody moving in more or less the same direction in order to make this successful. So what does that look like in practice? And I'll finish up with the idea of ACL injuries are kind of a wicked problem. And by that, I mean that we're dealing with an injury that in itself occurs for very complex reasons, and no two injury incidents are exactly alike. So that makes it complicated to prevent them. But we also have to remember that every single team in the world is operating in a very unique context. They have their own resources, their own challenges, and ultimately their own priorities as well. And so what I'd like to propose is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for preventing ACL injuries. And instead of thinking about, can we find what is the best prevention program, what is the best prevention strategy, I would argue that the best prevention strategy is the one that you're actually going to use. It's the one that fits your needs, that fits with your priorities, and ultimately fits into the context where you're trying to work. And so there are lots of different possible solutions that we might actually end up finding along the way, on the principle that doing something is better than doing nothing. And so ultimately, it's down to every team, every coach, every medical provider, every athlete to figure out what's going to work for me, what meets my needs, what fits within my context, and ultimately, what can I stick with for the duration of the season in order to give me the best preventative bang for my buck. And so I think that's where I'll leave you for today.
Thank you, Carly. Very insightful. I will also see if I can get Anna back. There's Anna as well. Hi all. We already had a few questions in the chat, so I think we can immediately kick this off with a few questions from Carola Kinyi in this case. She's from Kenya. She's a sports physician. And her first question is, she actually posed 3 questions, so we're starting with the first one, is would it be important to first have the health literacy assessment in the areas of ACL injury prevalence and the prevention strategies then to inform the best strategies? Maybe read that one first a little bit. I think, Anna, this relates closely to most of the work you have done in the past, also in younger athletes. And I scribbled a similar question down, I think. We focus mostly on the athletes already, footballers, but literacy and motor competence starts way before they get into the context of football. So basically, I think this question asks a little bit before the sport specificity. Are we not too late by having these injury prevention programs based on implicit feedback? Should we do it earlier?
Yeah, I didn't even touch on that because of time, of course. But what I often include in my presentations is we cannot account the football coaches alone for this, and have them use their valuable time for injury prevention only. So I think it starts already at birth. It's parents' responsibility to have kids play around, play outside, have them fall out of a tree, fall, stumble, etc. Develop the broad motor skills needed to to successfully play sports later on. Specialization, playing only one sport or letting kids play multiple sports for a longer time is important. So this is a very good question, and which is, I think, a responsibility for all of us as a community, as a society, for our children, to have them play sports safe and with lots of fun for as long as possible.
Thank you for that answer, Anna. And I think this answer kind of leads into the second question that Carola posted. How many of these programs are actually gender specific, age specific, based on disability status maybe, instead of just being football or handball or any other sport specificity?
I think we still need to get there. The way the programs are currently developed is not really specifying age, gender, even level. There's a FIFA 11 plus kids out now, but I think we should, with co-creation, so involve the athletes, involve the coaches, and maybe go even further, make it specific, like I think Carly also touched on, specific on the club, on the country, and then make sure that it works best in your specific setting. So we're not there yet, but it's clear that we need to include that specificity in addition to sports specificity, what I mentioned.
Yeah, that's I think immediately a nice bridge to Carly to bring her into this discussion. How much of that specificity to age groups or gender groups could be beneficial for implementation purposes?
Yeah, so I think regardless of what we're talking about, be it injury prevention or training more generally, the idea of tailoring programs to meet the very specific needs of the people using it not only tends to improve adherence, and there's quite a bit of evidence that it does, but it also gives us that comfort of knowing that actually this is something that is made for me to meet my needs, and it's taken into account the goals that I have in terms of performance, in terms of health, where I want to get to. And so it's a lot easier to buy into that and put the effort into that if you know that it's there specifically to help you meet your goals and needs. So I think there's a lot to be said, not only from a biomechanical, physiological, and gameplay perspective, that at different ages, different skill levels, all of those things, there are different needs within those football environments, no doubt. And ACL injuries tend to happen in slightly different ways, whether you're talking about women's football or men's football. So I think you're getting kind of a double whammy there. You're not only potentially having greater benefit from a mechanistic point of view, but you're also having that psychological boost as well that I think can only be beneficial.
So that's where the self-efficacy then starts to play a role.
Entirely.
Reminds me of an interesting study I once heard from Australia, where they looked at also some of the barriers towards implementing and doing exercise programs. And what most of the players said back to the researchers was, yeah, well, it's nice to have these beautiful videos and photographs and explanations, but can someone like me do it as well? Mm-hmm. So we really need to bring it down to their level. That was my take home from that study. A third question here, again from Karoli. Do the current studies on ACL injuries, and I must assume we're talking here about injury risk, also consider the loads that athletes are being exposed to?
Maybe I can jump on that one. You know that UEFA injury study
Please.
is monitoring the load or the exposure, at least, of the athletes to the training and the match. We don't monitor actual load, but exposure in minutes, yes. What we've seen in 20 and 4 season, it's actually a decrease of injuries regardless the fact of the increase of exposure, which is a bit contradictory to what is being published, but then also that is only on the elite level. We basically don't know what is happening below the elite level, so we cannot say. On the elite level, in 24 years, seasons of male study and 6 seasons now of women's study, we saw, again, disclosure, elite football. We saw overall decrease of injuries with the increase of hamstring injuries, which is quite high, but all other injuries are actually decreasing. So this is a bit contradictory. Of course, calendar and the question of recovery is a hot potato in football today. And it's unfortunately a bit hypocritical from all sides because, of course, clubs are talking they want to have more time, and then in that more time they send teams overseas to play matches because they also need to earn more money to pay players who are earning more money as well. And everybody has interest, including our organizations as well, for more matches to be played. There we have to, I would even say, create the consensus, not so much scientifically as much as between the different organizations, clubs and players as well.
And maybe I can add to that a little bit from my perspective. This is also a difficult statistical issue because, of course, the more you play, the more you put yourself at risk for injury. So if you play 2 matches instead of 1 match, you're twice exposed to the risk of an injury. That is not to say that if you play 2 matches, your risk is more than twice as high. So not all studies have considered this modification of exposure in relation to injury risk, and that is something that's going through here that is kind of murking the waters a little bit in the debate and in the discussion. So the evidence that we have available doesn't show very strong that there is this relationship, but it also doesn't show the relationship doesn't exist. So this will be an ongoing debate for a while, I might say. On that, so maybe a question from Daniel Hervas. I hope I pronounced that right. If there's any difference between prevention programs for players who play on artificial grass versus players that play on natural grass, are there any differences potentially in injury risk? Maybe I need to go to you for this one, Anna, because most of the exercises you've shown probably have an impact based on the turf you play on.
Yeah, but thanks. But I'm afraid I need to disappoint Daniel a little bit. There's not a lot of knowledge about it yet, Daniel. Maybe from a narrative point of view, people tend to expose or experience like higher impact forces on artificial grass. But I everything what I say would be a guess. So I'm not sure if anybody else can add to that, but it hasn't been researched yet or something like that. So I need to be careful.
Carly?
The only thing I can add, and this is borrowing a little bit from a different football code where we do have a little bit more research around that. So borrowing from rugby, from an implementation point of view, we do know that the adaptations that coaches and athletes make to the exercises are different depending on the surface that they're playing on. And a lot of that is simply down to, you know, if you're on a natural grass surface and in the mud, in most rugby playing countries, you're unlikely to do some of the strength building exercises that require you to lay down. Whereas on the artificial surfaces, they're more likely to use those exercises because they're clean and easily maintained. But that's about all we know, unfortunately.
Yeah, and one thing to add to that from the little bit I know about the literature is that not everybody plays on the same turf all the time. So you switch, one club has artificial turf, the other club has natural turf, and so it's really, really difficult to do a good study on that. And most likely, but that's more my personal gut feeling, it is the shoes you wear and such things that have much bigger impact on your injury risk on different varies of turf then your motor competency to play a good game of football without an increased injury risk. And that maybe boils down to context what you were talking about, Carly, because if I'm an amateur player and I play one game a week, I don't have 3 or 4 sets of soccer boots in my bag. I have one pair because else it's going to be too expensive for me. And that's probably at the lower levels a really important contextual factor. Zoran, you raised your finger.
I just wanted to add, it's also not only if it's artificial or the natural turf, it's also the quality of these turfs, because they're very variable and different throughout Europe. And that's something we are exploring to include in our injury study, because we get the, say, reports of the quality of turfs, whether they're not only artificial or natural, but also a quality, whether they're higher quality and what type of it. And then we will try to see if there's any correlation. But we will probably need to wait for some time for answers like this.
And
Anna?
I can add one thing. From a prevention standpoint of view, I showed one slide on differential learning. Like, it's good to practice on different surfaces and don't always practice on the same surface. So let them, artificial grass, natural grass, even snow, even just on the street and all that stuff. So that really makes them more adaptable to the different situations. So
is that the key word here, Anna? Adaptability? Because if I teach someone to do the same exercise over and over in a specific way, the moment something happens that's outside the realm of what I practiced, that's when the trouble occurs, usually, correct?
Yeah.
So you want to create as many strange possibilities as possible.
Yeah.
So the player is attuned to that.
Yeah, so maybe even in the practice session, if you're able to, don't practice on the field, but go to a different place in your village or town and practice there a little bit. So, or have them perform exercises on different surfaces, indeed, to increase their adaptability to the different situations.
And if I may follow that up with another question, you had this beautiful slide about the coach's role and the physiotherapist role. It goes from instructing players what to do to facilitating what to do. But at certain levels of play, if you have all these various players with various performance and physical measures and you name it, it's really difficult, isn't it? But do you have some tips and tricks on how to do that in real life?
It is difficult because you may have, I don't know, 15, 20 players on the field during a practice session. What you could do during your warming up, for example, is allow the players to, when they perform an exercise and they're done, allow them to approach you and ask, coach, can you give me feedback on this? And then you can give some individual feedback while the player is preparing for the next trial. So this needs to, it's necessary to maybe create some cultural change to have them ask for feedback. But I didn't even touch on that, but having them ask feedback when it suits them is also really beneficial for motor learning. And if you don't want to implement that yet, you can always try to pick out a player, give them personalized feedback with a more, like I said, supportive role instead of explicitly instructing them what to do. And yeah, that may be one example of tweaking it a little bit.
Okay, that brings it a little bit more into practical realm. Thank you. That's good. And it may be a similar question to you, Carly. I know the behavioral models you presented, and intention and how to drive that, but it's pretty far from reality. Behavioral change model. Well, there's attitude, there's social influence, self-efficacy. They challenge your intention, and then you may change your behavior. But now I need to go to my pitch tomorrow, and I need to do something with my team. what are a few tips and tricks that you can share with the people online on how to bring this to practice, these behavioral models?
Sure. So I think the big thing to remember is that these kind of behavioral models that we include in research, they're really rooted in just interaction between people. And so ultimately what we're talking about is if you're a coach or a physiotherapist or whatever your role is, and you're going to work with a group of athletes, is remember that they're a group of athletes and they're there to play, they're there to have fun, they're there to perform, they're there to improve. And instead of focusing so much on these are the risks if we don't do injury prevention and focusing on those negative messages, instead something just as simple as let's focus on building our confidence around doing these particular movements. They have performance benefits, they will help you be a better player, and guess what? They might keep you healthy as well. So starting with those little positive messages that focus on what might be gained instead of avoiding something negative that might happen is a simple thing. It's easy to do, and you can start small and work your way up. Some of the other things to do also is identify one or two players who can help champion injury prevention within the club. So think about sitting down and finding out what speaks to the players, what do they like doing, what don't they like doing, and then select some of those injury prevention strategies that you can adapt to fit in with either what your normal routines are, or think of them as a new little challenge that you might introduce gradually through the course of the season. So again, working on the principle that something is better than nothing, and just finding fun, engaging ways that you can do a little bit at a time, take some of that into a more practical approach, I think.
That goes back a little bit to your suggestion of considering this to be a wicked problem, which means we can't solve all of it, but anything we do is better than doing nothing, isn't it?
Exactly. And there is no one size fits all solution. It's about what works for you and what you think you can do in the time that you've got.
I think that is a perfect last sentence for today's webinar. Thank you, Carly. Thank you, Anna, both once again, for sharing your valuable insights. More to come, and I'm sure this is not the last we've seen and heard of you on either this webinar or on the podcast we also have, because there's much, much more to say. Thank you all. Before we log off, Zoran, maybe you want to say one or two words to the audience?
Just wanted to say that this webinar and some questions and comments later done by Carol actually shows that our campaign that will start immediately after Euro, men's Euro, and will run ahead of the women's Euro next year, about the awareness of ACL campaign, need for education, but not only of the coaches, but of the players as well, because we need to bring them all on board if we want to succeed. And we definitely need to hear all of their opinions as well, and reasons why they are not doing the very good preventive programs, or preventive programs that look very good to us. Maybe they don't look very good to them.
Thank you, Zoran. I'm going to say goodbye to you as well.
Thank you.
And then I will say then I will say goodbye to everybody. Thank you again for being in this webinar. We're going to have a little break of 2 months to celebrate summer and celebrate Euro. Please, if you have any suggestions for future topics, we do have a list, of course, but any feedback or input is welcome. Please send it to our general email address, which I just put in the comment box as well. And any suggestions to improve these webinars, of course, is also welcome. Stay tuned and enjoy Euro, enjoy your summer, and see you all afterwards. Thank you for joining today.